All right. There you go. All right, so my name is Cecilia. I'm a political scientist here at UC Berkeley, and I do work that is both with experimental and observational data. And in terms of the body of work, I broadly defined, kind of categorize my work as comparative political behavior. So I do a lot of work these days that are looking at the effects of inequality on voting behavior and public opinion, and exploring various interventions around how to cultivate democratic citizenship, like increased political participation. All right, so first going to present this map, which I'm sure you saw on day one. So we are in sort of the blue arrow with today's session, just really thinking about pre-analysis plans and how that can be used for reducing researcher degrees of freedom and hoping to minimize scientific misconduct, and really contributing towards how to have the research community be a lot more transparent and ethical. So that's where we're at in this roadmap, just these little blue cells. And when we're thinking about research credibility and why we do pre-registration, I'm sure you went over a lot of these themes on day one, but this all started because at this juncture, there's really been this research credibility crisis in empirical social science, right? In terms of, there's been evidence of outright fraud of some folks within our community. And that is harmful for all of us, right? Because if we start seeing these cases in which research is really not one that's right, then the general community starts questioning all types of findings that we have, some of which are true, right? And so it's really damaging if we as a community don't think through how to have just research done in a way that is credible. Right? It just takes us a couple of examples, some New York Times exposés to start having everyone start questioning what empirical social science is really contributing and what is true and what is not true. Right, so that's where we're at, and these are all then responses and reactions to think through how do we then make social science research more credible. And so one of the proposed solutions for doing that, right, has been large-scale replications of experiments, and another has been pre-analysis plans, which is what we're going to talk through today. And in those discussions of pre-analysis plans and large-scale replications, they've largely focused on experimental research. Right, so there have been lots of conversations, dialogues, papers that have really been written to think through how do you have pre-registration done properly as it relates to experiments. But what does that mean for observational research, right? When all of those conversations are really centered around experimental work. And so that's where we're here today, trying to think through how can we take some of these conversations that have started as it relates to experiments and think through how to then engender greater credibility as it relates to observational work, because we can't, I think the alternative is just like, put our hands up and say, well, observational data, this stuff just doesn't apply. And that doesn't sound quite right either, right? So in thinking through how to do transparent social science, if we just kind of give a complete pass to work related to observational data, then it means that we're basically saying we're not going to think about transparency as it relates to really big, important questions. Right? So when we're thinking about social science and what kinds of questions social scientists explore, some of the most important questions fundamentally rely on observational data. Right? So if we're thinking about elections, there's historical election data, that's observational data. Conflict, wars, various registries that are talking about the number of deaths or number of attacks, observational data. Legislative roll call votes in terms of how electeds are voting. Various data sets that have been compiled about social movements. And now increasingly big data from say Twitter and tweets, those are data that are really rich and worth exploring. And it is then harmful to think, okay, those kinds of questions are excused from thinking about how to do work in a transparent and ethical fashion. And when we're looking at the vast majority of papers that are published in social science, we really see that most of the work is relying on observational data. Right. So this was something that was compiled by Fiona Burlig in a 2018 Economic Letters piece. And she found that only 3% of papers in top economics journals were field randomized control trials. And between 2005 and 2011, approximately 80% of published empirical research in 3 of the top economics journals, the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and the Quarterly Journal of Economics, were non-experimental studies. So if we're not going to be thinking about how to have observational data, work using observational data to be transparent, we're basically giving a pass to pretty much the majority of studies that are really being put out there. Okay. And when we're looking at different subfields within economics, and this is not, I mean, I noted that I'm a political scientist. As I note economics as the example, this is not because other social sciences don't have these patterns. It's more that these articles have been published in the economics field, so we can actually note that, you know, through a systematic process of review, we at least know these numbers for economics. But I would expect that if a similar exercise were done in sociology or in political science or anthropology and other social sciences, we'd see something similar. Psychology might be an exception where a lot of work is using lab experiments, but at least within a lot of social science field, I'd expect these patterns that we see in the field of economics to be to hold up. So at least, you know, when this exercise was done looking at public economics, development economics, labor economics, we're seeing similar patterns, right? That the vast majority of papers are consistently non-experimental in nature. Okay. Now, there's then been this interesting work that was done by Brodeur, Lee, Sagnier, and Zilbergerg, and I probably butchered all of those last names, so I'm going to apologize to those authors. But they did this interesting work where they were looking for evidence of p-hacking. And they looked for evidence of p-hacking in both experimental and non-experimental papers. And if we think about, you know, what we should see when there is p-hacking, in the absence of p-hacking, we'd expect a perfectly smooth distribution of z statistics with perhaps one peak to a threshold z statistic for publication. Now, in the presence of authors p-hacking to get p-values just below some desired threshold for publication, especially 0.05 or a z statistic of just above 1.96, the distribution would then have 2 peaks. So when we analyze all the papers published in AER, JPE, and QJE between 2000 and 2011, these authors find that the distribution of experimentally produced Z statistics, which is on the left-hand panel, is single peaked with a slight second bump, while the non-experimental distribution, which is on the right-hand side, has 2 sharp peaks. So the analyses that the authors are doing, they're trying to argue that when we look for evidence of p-hacking, it seems like there is more of that in non-experimental papers than there are in experimental papers. Right? So if you're interested in looking more, look at that paper, and then Kaufman and Nader in 2015 also have an interesting conversation around evidence of p-hacking. So what is the purpose then of pre-registration, right? It should provide documentation on the research design. And this documentation is then public for readers to review, right? And what does that do when we have a public-facing documentation of one's research design? The idea is that when it's publicly available and there's a timestamp, it will limit researchers' degrees of freedom in terms of what they are going to do when they have that data on hand. And the other idea is, like, when you do this work before doing any analysis, the hope is that it will encourage well thought out projects with strong theoretical and empirical justifications, right? Otherwise, you might just look for a specification that conveniently gets you a finding that is desirable and that's consistent with something that that you want to argue, and that's problematic. Right? There have been some arguments around, well, maybe we should just have different questions be explored with all possible specifications that are reasonable. Now, the risk of doing that is that it's really pushing theory into the background and then not having the specification, the empirical strategy, be one that's really aligned with the theoretical argument that you're trying to make, right? So there are some risks to, well, why don't we not specify an empirical strategy and just consider all possible specifications and see what the bounds are, right? So how do observational studies fit into the research transparency landscape? When we're thinking about observational data, it immediately poses some credibility challenges, right? So on the one hand, many observational studies are using public data. This is fantastic from the standpoint of transparency, accessibility, right? That data is there for everyone to access. So in that sense, there's no issue in terms of, oh, was there any kind of malfeasance in terms of the data generation process? And everyone can access it, so there aren't these accessibility issues, right? So in many ways, observational studies that rely on public data is really great from the standpoint of kind of transparency of the data generation process and in terms of accessibility for all scholars. But it does hinder pre-registration. It's hindering pre-registration because there's often no credible way to verify that pre-registration of public data took place before the analysis was done. Right? You can't claim not to have seen, say, some household living standards survey or a national election study survey that is there for everyone to access, right? Those very reasons for why public use data is wonderful from an accessibility and transparency standpoint are the very reasons why it's difficult to credibly pre-register those studies. So what do we do? Should I just end the session here and say, like, too bad, it's great, we have to do something with observational studies, but nothing can really be done because it's difficult to really credibly say, I thought through my data analysis plan before looking at the research? That seems, that would be, I think some would say, like, yes, like, you can't do it and let's move on. And that's probably why so much of the conversations has been about experimental work. But I think there's many of us that are trying to push over the last, you'll see a lot of articles kind of coming out in the last couple of years trying to figure out, like, no, it's not just all or nothing, right? There are ways in which we can think through enhancing credibility for observational research. So this is a question that is in one of the registries, the OSF registry, that you could register a pre-analysis plan. And it asks explicitly an explanation of existing data. So this comes up if you select that you are actually using existing data as opposed to creating new data, right? And so if we're in this world in which we're using public use data, that's existing data. Now it says, if you indicate that you'll be using some data that already exists in the study, please describe the steps you have taken to assure that you are unaware of any patterns or summary statistics in the data. This may include an explanation of how access to the data has been limited, who has observed the data, or how you have avoided observing any analysis of the specific data you will use in your study. I think some of my students, when they see this, they respond with, like, isn't this just more kind of like a trust me, I assure you I didn't do these things? And like, how do you even go about answering this in a way that is believable to anyone other than, trust me, I swear I didn't look at it, right? I swear on my mother's name, right? Like, what can you say here to actually have people believe you when you answer this question? So there have been some efforts to think through how to do this. But before I go into what other scholars have figured out, I'd love for you all to just kind of have a short conversation, maybe 3 to 5 minutes, to just think through, when you see this, what are the things that kind of come to mind in terms of how you go about answering this question? And then we'll come back and then talk through some of the things that came up for you. And then I'll go over some of the studies that have been done, or more not so much studies, but these sort of dialogues and letters that have been written in terms of recommendations of how to answer this question and when we can believe an answer. I think I saw one hand. Yeah, go ahead, Simone.
Yeah, apologies. Simone Sacchi.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. I mean, it's about, actually data reuse and the idea that, you should try to build on somebody else's data. So I guess I would like your opinion on what happens when you've read studies, citing a specific data sets. So you ended up reading the studies. So it's not just that you did it because you wanted to have, a sneak peek into the data or summaries of that. It means that you cannot use those data. So, or at least that, it's enough to declare that you've seen studies and summaries of those data, but those data are still important for your research, because it seems that, you might be biased because of that situation, but it's kind of natural in science. You read papers, you find data that might be interesting, you think, that's the process, I guess. So
Absolutely.
That's kind of my question.
That's exactly the kind of thing that comes to mind in terms of how do you actually answer this question? It feels impossible, right? Because many times, like as scholars, you are looking at other people's work and you're inspired by something that you read there, or you read something about the data and be like, ooh, that's really interesting. And I think this question that I have can really be can be answered using this data. But then technically you've seen some of the data through the lens of other authors, right?
Exactly.
So that's exactly right, of why this has become difficult to think through. So I want you all to have conversations like that in the breakout session. Like I said, just a couple minutes, because I'd love for you to think through like all your immediate reactions that come to mind around how to do this, when I just established the vast majority of work is with observational studies. We don't want to say, well, let's not do observational studies because we can't actually pre-register them. That doesn't seem appropriate. But it also seems inappropriate to say observational studies get a full pass in terms of thinking about issues of transparency and doing some efforts around pre-registration, which is intended to try to have things be more ethical, right? To ensure that there isn't fraudulent behavior within our research community. So Vanessa she's provided a link for the discussion, the breakout session. And when you're assigned to a particular room, just go to the slide that has your room number. Everyone's exploring the same question, but this is just more for organizing, where you can sort of like jot down some of the notes that you have as you all have conversations.
Cecilia, quick question.
Yes.
You don't want to be in a breakout room, right?
No, because I don't want to change.
Okay, so it'll assign you to a room, but just exit the room. And Katie, same thing to you. Just exit the room once you're assigned to it.
Cool.
All right, I'm opening the rooms. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I think since we are hosts or co-hosts, and it won't automatically put us in there. Yeah, that's easier. Chinenye or Mateus, we are doing breakout rooms. So if you don't see a link, let us know. Otherwise, you can join the room that shows up on your Zoom screen. Cecilia and Vanessa, there's another person in here named Zui who's also, she's our intern, so she won't necessarily need.
So would love to just, I see the notes that were populated in the slides, but would love to hear just some things that came up during your conversations.
Okay. I can just read it. In some instances, the data summarized in a report unreported. If conducting research on the original piece of data and read the report, what do you fill in?
Why don't we circle back to that? So we'll go through the scenarios, and then I think there's going to be other notes of like, well, how about this? How about this? Because there are so many different kinds of situations. So we'll go over sort of, here are kind of the best case scenarios in terms of observational data where you can really credibly pre-register, and they're not being this issue of questioning whether or not there was data access before pre-registering, where it's sort of easier to answer that question that you all just talk through. All right, so this first scenario, the pre-analysis plan for researcher-generated data, sort of the easiest scenario in which to pre-register observational research, right? If it's data that you all are collecting, you're going to be familiar with the structure of the data set as you're developing whatever instrument it is to collect this data. You will have full clarity around those measures because, again, you are creating them. You have complete control over data collection timeline to the extent that there is some control with donors and so forth, but you have more control over that. And the well-developed pre-analysis plan guidance for experimental research then is fully applicable here, because you are collecting the data. So it's not as though data is only collected, like original data is only collected for experimental work. That's not the case, right? So here's a set of work, this large body of work that's really researcher developed. Then all of the various advice around doing pre-analysis plans for that data set for experiments completely applies. And you could credibly answer that question because you actually didn't have existing data before you pre-registered. You just had knowledge around what that data would look like. And so you can do all of those, you can answer that question credibly. I didn't actually have access. So easiest scenario. Scenario 2. So these are prospective analyses. So this is when you could pre-register observational research prior to data being made publicly available. So say there is going to be sort of another round of the ad health data that's going to come out, and you have full access to all the prior rounds, but there's an additional round that's going to, a new wave that's going to be released a year from now. And you know that it's going to be released, and you know what kinds of questions were being asked. Then you could pre-register, like, yes, you are leveraging some of the existing data, but there's this new data that you know is coming that no one has access to because it hasn't been released yet. So you can do pre-registration for these sort of prospective analyses, even in the world in which you are still leveraging some existing data. The fact is you are using new data that no one has had access to, and you have some information in terms of what kinds of questions will be asked. So you could do pre-analysis plans for these prospective analyses. And there was a good example of that. This is, at least within the econ space, the first documented pre-analysis plan of observational data that was done by David Newmark. And he wrote a pre-analysis plan to study the impact of the October 1996 US federal minimum wage increase. So he knew that there was going to be a federal minimum wage increase, right? It's big policy. So he knew when that was going to happen. And he knew that there was going to be a new current population survey data, like new CPS data set that was going to come out in 1997. And it's going to be the same kinds of questions that CP has asked in the past, but it will be from 1997. So he wrote a pre-analysis plan before that May 1997 release. And so hence the pre-registration, right? knowing that there was a policy shift, knowing that there was going to be a data set that he could use to really answer this question around the impacts of minimum wage increases. And so was able to write a pre-analysis plan that was of a prospective nature and was very much viewed as a credible effort to do a pre-registration for observational data, as no one questioned the timestamp, right? The pre-registration came before that May 1997 release. So another scenario in which there's going to be less quibbling around the legitimacy of the "I did not peak" claim. Data was literally not available. And many data sets are really amenable to this prospective pre-specification, because these large data sets will announce like what date they're going to release that data. So you'll have a sense of, oh, it's going to come out on like this month. Like maybe you won't know the exact date, but you'll have a sense of what time period it will be released. So you have this sort of deadline of like, I should pre-register before that release date. Okay, and in the case of these large data sets where there's multiple waves, these institutions that collect this data often publish the survey instruments before the data set is released. So you'll actually have information around the measures, right? So you can actually say, I'm going to use like these 10 questions as it relates to constructing my dependent variable. And here's a set of questions that I'm going to look at for the purpose of like my controls. And these are the questions that I'm going to leverage to look at group heterogeneity or whatnot. You'll actually have information that you can use. And then there's also information around sampling and other things that, that are usually within these documentations. So you can actually have really great information around just the data collection process too. So another scenario in which you could do a credible pre-registration in the world of using observational data. Okay. Scenario 3, restricted access data. So increasingly, researchers are partnering with private or public institutions to get access to proprietary, confidential, I wrote confidential twice, restricted access data. Okay, so this could be like healthcare data, firm data of different corporations, some high resolution spatial information from different groups. So in those cases, these aren't public use data sets. They may have already been collected, but there's a whole set of hurdles that one has to cross to gain access to this data. So with restricted data, you can make some arguments around sort of the time in which you got access. So it's easier to argue when you have seen or not seen the data, because when you're accessing restricted access data, there usually is some kind of data use agreement or transfer record. Organizations that have their data, they're not going to just freely share it with groups. There's usually some MOU, non-disclosure agreement, some kind of document that notes what is the data that you're getting, when are you getting it, and what is the data being used for. That document can be attached to your pre-analysis plan that provides a timestamp on when that data exchange happened. Right, and so that provides a credible documentation of sort of the time period in which data access occurred. And so it opens up a new interesting space for then more transparent research, right? You can use these MOUs, NDAs, data use agreements, transfer records as an added documentation to prove that data access happened after you pre-register your analysis plan. Okay. And what's nice in this scenario is that data requests often require information that is going to then be information that pre-analysis plans also require of you, right? The organizations that are potentially sharing the data with you, they're going to want to know, well, what measures do you want? What are you using it for? What is the research question that you're trying to answer? And those are exactly the kinds of questions, right, that are being asked in any kind of registry, right? What's your research question? What measures? Like, what is a data set? All of those things are actually often contained within the data request form and the data use agreement. And so it will then sort of limit the extra effort that you as a scholar needs to put in to convert that data request form to a full pre-analysis plan. Right, so the very act of applying for getting access to the data can be used to sort of save time in creating the pre-analysis plan. Right? You can kill two birds with one stone. Now, in this case, in scenario 3, there's another issue that happens, right? So on the one hand, when you're accessing restricted access data, you can kind of create this timestamp by way of having this paper trail. But restricted access data then creates another type of transparency issue, which is you're not actually allowed to share that information, which then creates this replication problem, right? Like you fix something, but in using this, like it's kind of compromising another aspect of research transparency, which is enabling replication, like after you've gone through the whole effort and published and try to publish your work. And different journals are going to have different policies around replication and research transparency. So this is from the American Political Science Review submission guidelines. In the end, like they are requiring the data sets and code necessary to reproduce all results, including in-text references, blah, 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 unless legal, ethical, or methodological constraints prevent such data sharing, right? So various journals are acknowledging that sometimes you can't actually fully share that information. So you can still publish, but it is good, as we're thinking about how to do transparent research, to acknowledge that in scenario 3, we can kind of solve one problem, but it presents another problem, like when we're looking broadly at how to do research in a transparent fashion. And the academic community is really trying to grapple with this as it relates to restricted access data, because we're recognizing there's a lot of really interesting questions that can be answered with partnerships. And it makes sense that that data shouldn't just be widely publicly available. There's confidential information, and we want to be really careful. Organizations want to be really careful in terms of how to share that information and when to share it. So this was an exchange that was happening with Michael White, who was talking about what the policy would be for the journal Nature, right? A very prominent journal. And it was noting that if you can't, you can't share data, then like it shouldn't be published. And so Fiona Burlig, who I'm citing here in terms of like these scenarios in which observational data can credibly be pre-registered, she was noting, does this mean, so this was like a tweet conversation, does this mean that research produced using data under an NDA cannot be published in Nature journals? For better or for worse, this is a large share of empirical work in econ these days. He asked, well, what sort of data tend to be under NDA in econ? Is there any chance of making anonymized data available? Then she tried to explain, well, it's things like IRS information, it's just not stuff that she was going to be really in a position to share. And his response is like, I very much suspect, but would have to confirm that we would be okay with cases like this. So these exchanges are occurring, right, in terms of trying to figure out, as journals try to put in nudges, some that are more formal than others, of trying to have research be transparent and reproducible. How do you then respond in cases where it's really not some issue with the researcher, they're just not in a position to share their data? And observational studies that are published with data sharing exemptions is growing. So, we're talking through how to fix a problem, but now I'm presenting another problem. So the share of papers that are really leveraging partnerships with these restricted access requirements, they're growing. So I did want to provide then, one way of trying one study that I've done that uses restricted access data. It's not a perfect solution, but it does at least try to introduce transparency and encourage reproducibility, is by actually creating with the partner that you have a confidentiality agreement at the outset, right? So talking with the partner and saying, if this study gets published, there is going to be a desirable thing that we want to encourage, which is reproducibility, right? To add credibility and just openness to the study that took place. And so you can form an agreement right at the outset with the partner as you do the data use agreement around what is the minimum amount of data that can be shared that is stripped of all the confidential information that still allows the reproduction to be possible, the replication to be possible, right? So I had a partnership with a nonprofit. We agreed, okay, like these are three measures that are essential for analysis, and none of the confidential information is necessary, right? Rarely do you need names and contact information of individuals, for instance, for the purpose of answering a research question, right? Like, so strip it of all those things, but these three core things are necessary for the purpose of reproduction. And they were amenable to having a confidentiality agreement that was created so that anyone who wants to reproduce my work, they have a contact within the organization, and then they can sign this confidentiality agreement, and there's a mechanism for them then getting the piece of restricted access data that's necessary for reproducing the work. And the researcher and scholar who wants to reproduce, like they're saying, I'm only accessing this data for the purposes of reproducing and replication, nothing else, right? So there are ways that you could also then help solve the issues that are created with restricted access data as it relates to replication. All right, so recap, for observational studies, they can be pre-registered, at least according to this economic letters piece, under these three scenarios. But is there any other scenarios that come to mind, right? So that was a conversation that the research community was having in 2018. But then there have been further conversations around like, well, what else, are there any other scenarios in which we could have credible pre-registration? So one that I wanted to introduce to you all is something that I've been working on with two scholars at Yale and someone at Stanford. And we were talking about trying to think through an observational open science approach for replication of observational studies, right? So this is about replications, and again, we've heard a lot around replications of experimental work. I think we've heard less about replications of observational studies, right? Because it's not as though there is this experiment that you can just sort of redo and see if the same results hold up. So when we're thinking about observational studies and replications of observational studies, I don't know if you've seen any exchanges around research questions that have really only been answered through observational analyses, but those conversations are often really confusing. And they're really confusing because when they're doing this supposed replication, you see large changes in the empirical strategy, right? So it's more of, oh, if I add these controls, or if I do fixed effects in this way, I get different findings. And so then it actually then becomes an argument around what is the right specification, right? And then in some cases, they're trying to answer the question with some kind of case that's altogether different. And then you can quibble with, well, is this an appropriate case to really do this work? So replications as it relates to thinking through questions that have been established in the observational space can be really, really confusing. So this is work trying to figure out how do you make that process less confusing and less combative around like, this is the right empirical strategy. No, this is the right empirical strategy. So we tried to think through what happens, and we want to do this right because while there's worries around p-hacking for original work, for replications, there is an issue of potential null hacking. You could try to find the specification that makes the statistical significant finding go away. And you can do specification searches to do that. Because if we're thinking about incentives for publication, whereas the initial incentive for original work might be to find statistically significant findings because, you know, maybe editors and reviewers are going to be more excited about those things. When you're thinking about replication, what's more interesting and exciting is this is work that says like, actually that original work is wrong, right? Studies that say, I agree with the original work. That tends to be less splashy, or it might be things where authors might think like, I might not really be able to get that well placed. And so that sort of ends up in the file drawer. So there's issues around null hacking that we want to prevent for replications, especially in the observational study space, because there's less issues with null hacking in the experimental world because if you conduct an experiment, one of the beauties of experiments is that sort of the analytical strategy is actually fairly simple. So we need to prevent null hacking, and that's a phrase that Protzko put out in a 2018 piece. So how do we make pre-analysis plans of replications of observational studies more credible? And you might read this and say like, I still don't believe it, but again, let's not let perfect be the enemy of some progress. So these are some proposals. So we did note that it is important to pre-register replication efforts. Yes, it is hard to say you didn't peek at the data because you literally read these papers, and so you have all this information around the data. So it doesn't really seem credible to say you didn't look at the data as you're trying to replicate different work that has been done. However, you can do a couple things. First, you can build a team with mixed incentives for replication exercises. When you combine original authors that might have an incentive to replicate and new authors that might actually have an incentive to not replicate, and you can get that team to actually agree on the parameters of various study alterations and how to think through what specifications to pursue, that tends to be more believable, right? It's one thing if one person is lying. It's another thing if, say, like a team of 10 scholars are all lying together, right? If 10 scholars are all saying, no, we completely pre-registered this without looking at the data, and all 10 of them can say that, then that starts feeling a lot more believable, especially if that team is of mixed incentives, right? As opposed to, say, 10 new scholars who might all have an incentive to nullify an existing finding, or 10 authors that all have an incentive to replicate, right? So mixed incentive teams. The other things that can be used is by including out-of-sample observations. So this is kind of putting in that scenario 2 that I noted before, right? So if we're, say, looking at a study of elections, and the original studies all took place kind of with the last election being 2008. What's nice is after 2008, there were more elections. So you can actually add data. And you can say, all right, well, I'm now including new data that hasn't been explored in those existing studies. So I don't know the full descriptives of this new sample. And if you do the pre-registration before, say, one of the observations is released, right? So doing a pre-registration in 2019 and saying, I'm going to do this when the 2020 election cycle comes in. It's like, yes, the majority of the data sort of already existed when you're pre-registering, but you are still trying to include some of that prospective piece to add believability, a credibility that you didn't look at all of the data patterns before doing the analysis. So you can add out of sample observations by leveraging that passage of time. So in the readings that I sort of recommended for this session so included the study, so you can take a look at how we thought through the pre-registration, and then the final paper that used this pre-registration, right? And we were a mixed team because Neil and we were authors of the original study, one of the original studies, and then Matthew and Greg, who were at Yale, they were not, right? So they were sort of I'm perfectly happy to find no effects. That's probably going to be more splashy, right? So those were the mixed incentives that we tried to create in this team, so that we were trying to be experimenting with whether or not our approach could really work, with trying to use this approach to engage within a research question as around whether or not irrelevant events mattered in terms of how people were voting. So when we're thinking about observational pre-analysis plans, the main ingredients, right? You want to think at minimum, you have to think through, you're going to have to offer some things around basic research design, data description, hypotheses to be tested, and some discussion of like how you're going to make inferences pertaining to the research question that you have. And it can be good to also include, say, estimating equations that you're looking to use, right? What are the specifications and what are the set of controls that you're looking to include? Any heterogeneity analyses that you're wanting to pursue, different robustness checks that you know are good to do with the analysis that you're pursuing. And if you are aware of some issues that might come up with the data, like various contingencies that you might have. So these would be the core ingredients that you want to think through when putting together your original observational study pre-analysis plan. And when you are pre-registering in practice, not all registries are going to accept observational data. So the AEA registry, it only registers experiments, right? So it's not as though you can register in all registries with observational data, but the OSF registry does, right? So when you are starting a registration in OSF at the design plan stage, you'll see this question of please check one of the following statements around what your study type is, and you'll see that there is this category of observational study, right? Data is collected from study subjects that are not randomly assigned to a treatment. So there's a category for the set of studies that we're talking about today, right? So can't just say like, oh, none of these registries are conducive for experiments. In fact, the OSF registry has made efforts to try to have questions and categories that then try to encourage those who do observational work to register their study.
Cecilia, there was a quick question on the chat. Ingmar, would you like to just say your question to the group? Otherwise, I can read it.
No, sure. Yeah, so I learned from some colleagues in physics that, and for data collected in physics, astronomical data, etc., frequently there is some system, and I'm not much aware of the details, but there's some system of altering the data before the scientists actually analyze it. And I'm sure this must be like two separate groups, one who keeps the original set of data, the other one who analyzed the altered set of data. And then only after the analysis is finished is the alteration reversed, so to speak, right? So after you've written all of your code, and so that while you're conducting the study, you're not influenced by the data and the kinds of analyses that you conduct. And I was just curious whether this would be a thing that you think could also be implemented in a social science setting.
Absolutely. And kind of conversations like that have also happened within doing like pre-registration for experiments. So I think this sort of speaks to what Kathleen was noting, which was, what if, some people have, some co-authors have access to the restricted access data already and then others do not? There are ways of trying to kind of create teams. So Ted Miguel, he, who you heard from in day one, he noted with experiments that sometimes he likes having the team that's in the field not be writing the pre-registration, right? So actually creating separation between individuals in terms of different tasks. And so that creates this sort of like parallel process where there can't be sort of like an unintended bias that gets introduced to kind of creating a pre-registration because you like know too much, right? Like you've already sort of peaked, or like you have some sense of what things are going to look like. So there have been conversations about like, can you, especially as social science becomes a lot more where you have more teams doing the work, right? I think in the natural sciences for a while, you've had these very large teams, right? With like laboratories. In social sciences, that's not always the case, right? Like sometimes there's just like one author or two authors, like you don't have these like large teams. But especially as we're now pursuing work that involves, say, like big data, restricted access data, and other things that are just really complex, more and more work is being done in teams. And when you have teams, then you can start creating these separations between different members of the team, where hopefully it's not introducing sort of like a second class citizen dynamic, but it's just more like for the purposes of trying to do things in a transparent fashion, trying to create some divisions that are then going to be more conducive for doing honest work. Right. So these things have not been systematized, Igmar, but certainly conversations are being had and different individuals are trying out different processes of creating kind of separation between members of a collaboration to try to, have practices be done in a way that is credible from like a reader perspective of like, oh, wow, this team like really was thoughtful about how to ensure that there isn't bias and that an analytical strategy wasn't created with like full access to the data.
Thank you.
Yeah. And as I said, like this space, it's still relatively new, right? All of these conversations are being had in the last 5 years. And so more and more folks are trying to figure this out in terms of what are different things that we can try, because there really isn't a perfect solution that can take into account all the different ways in which observational data could be leveraged for meaningful research. So if you take anything away from this, though, I hope you can see that observational studies can be pre-registered, right? And outright reject a sentiment that observational studies are just in a different category. And all of the different conversations that are being had around research transparency don't apply for observational data, right? That's just false. You can do pre-registration with observational studies to enhance research transparency. There are cases in which you can credibly show you haven't touched the data, right? Present at least 3 scenarios today, but there are others that maybe we can create in the future as we think through different mechanisms and means of like team constructions and divisions of labor. So novel data, future events, and restricted access data, at least at this point, already allow for a credible attestation that you haven't touched the data before you pre-registered. And for replication studies, we're, not everyone is in agreement with this, but at least there's a camp that I'm part of that thinks leveraging teams in the passage of time can enable credible pre-analysis plans for replication studies of observational work, as that space often tends to be a disaster, right? Of just my specification is right, no, your specification is right, and it's just not helpful. And doing this pre-registration, much like in the experimental world, doing this can lessen the extra, like it doesn't necessarily need to be more work, because the more you do sort of at the outset, the less you need to do later, because you sort of set up why certain questions matter, why certain measures are critical, and why a particular design is the right design. Now, I do want to say that having a pre-analysis plan should not preclude researchers from conducting additional analyses that are not pre-registered. So I think that's one of the kind of most common questions that I get of, well, you know, sometimes I look at the data, and by looking at the data, I sort of see there's other things that need to be done, and I didn't pre-register it, so what do I do, right? Because I do want to come off as a transparent and credible researcher, but I didn't pre-register this, and I think it's important, and I just didn't know these things until I was working with the data. That is absolutely okay to do additional work that has not been pre-registered. Usually the best practice is then you just indicate what analyses were pre-registered and what weren't. That's it. All you have to do, right? It is okay that you did not know all of these things prior to pre-registration, and that you learned things around the data and what to do with pursuing your research question after you had the data on hand. So you can just simply note, these are the pre-registered analyses, these are not. And that's being transparent, and that's being honest, and it's not necessarily taking away from the transparency of your work. But it is, you know, worth acknowledging all replication or non-replication observational studies cannot be credibly pre-registered. So it's not as though I've sort of introduced something that means that all observational studies can be pre-registered. We haven't figured that out yet, right? It's hard to really say that all observational studies can credibly be pre-registered. And I'm sure you can think of a host of scenarios in which it'll be more difficult to do in a particular case. But sort of as like a last question to explore together, like what risks, if any, are there if we do not think about how to increase transparency of observational research?